Hey, it's Joe Solari, and welcome to the Business of Writing. Today, our special guest is Alex Newton. How you doing, Alex?
Hey, hello everybody. I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for the invite.
I know you've been hard at work while you're sheltering in place, pulling together the data, and uh, I was really excited to see some of the things that you've discovered, and thought it'd be great to have you on and really kind of get a feel for what you're seeing in the economy in general, as well as what your data is showing you specifically about the author market.
Got you. Well, let's look into some of the data. Let's discuss it. Also, I did share some of the data over the last. Frankly, it's only like a week or so, but there wasn't much chance also to discuss some of the results since you're also working for some of the big name authors. Would be interesting to see how the data we have on the market and economy. What do you see reflected in like the literal sales data of your clients, because also they represent in many categories, some of the big name
Yeah,
sellers. So
yeah.
I think it could be a very interesting discussion to look how the things tie together. So yeah, we did basically for today. We did look at a couple of things. One is, very crudely U.S. retail data, and here I have an update which is exclusive here on your channel, just from
Awesome.
this week. So that is, I found that very interesting. And by the way, it's also a piece of good news. There is not only bad news these days. We looked at the print sales, the ebook sales, format shifts, what happened to pricing during the time, and what happened in certain categories. So exciting stuff to discuss. And I mean, what's the whole point? I mean, the whole point is many of us, we're all in the lockdowns and buried in our writing caves, or in my case, data analysis caves. And you just see your own sales happening. Is it going up or down? And sometimes I think it feels good if you get a bit of a radar screen of what's happening in this obscure and dangerous environment these days
Yeah.
out there, right? So
Well,
so
and the other thing is, while I know that books and selling books has been around for hundreds of years, as far as in some of these newer formats, and certainly things like Kindle, this really is kind of one of the first big downturns that people have had to get through.
true, true, and in to some respect, it may even have helped the Kindle device and the format also when we look at device sales. But let's jump into some numbers.
Yeah,
You
sure.
stop me, Joe, when you want to discuss. And also obviously we don't want to do here a big canned presentation, but I can share a couple of these things. I just here called this COVID-19 impact on book sales, although there is a lot around it. And um, as said before, if we just go into the retail consumption in the US, this graph to me means a lot of good news, because what it does show is, in February everything was okay. In March, even the first 2 weeks of March were okay. And basically, by the way, for those who are not into graphs and numbers, what this thing shows is red is bad. The more red, the worse. Green is okay or good. And what this shows is every bar is the percentage growth or decline of basically general merchandise US retail consumption at the point of sale for general merchandise, is basically an indicator of what is happening out there in the stores. So this is not online sales. This is really what's happening out there in the stores, including, by the way, physical bookstores, right? So what was happening, as we all know, is by the end of March, after all the lockdowns, this hit an all-time low where the last week of March were 31% down compared to the same week in 2019.
Mm.
And that was around the time when we started this analysis. And what we saw happening was then that even 1 week later, it was still down compared to the previous year, but you see already not as bad as that minus 31% week. The week later, after Easter, it was getting better. Then the 18th was getting better. And then what was very interesting, the company NPD group, which is big market research firm, reported then that basically the last, the week of the 25th, things back to normal, meaning, no decline of sales versus the prior year. They meanwhile took down the blog post, but it seems some of it was related to the date of Easter. But even if we take that outlier away and look at the data from just last week, minus 4% versus prior year, which to me looks like, wow, out there in the storefront, some things are recovering, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good sign. And the big question is, how did that decline obviously translate into the book sales? And the first people who really got hit were obviously the physical bookstores. We all know, the Barnes and Nobles of the world and smaller ones all closed down. They tried to shift some of the volume onto their online channels, but obviously that also doesn't happen over time. So for March, NPD BookScan reported a minus 7%.
Mm.
And I think that's also interesting because what is a much worse decline overall in the retail business did not translate into like one-to-one, a huge decline in sales. So the numbers for April are not there yet, but they are there to come. If we look at the previous exhibit, if we compare March to April, I think we can expect that the April number for physical print sale may even a little bit worse, although the people who report the numbers basically said Easter was a big help. Some online sales were a big help. So time will tell. But that is what is happening on the physical book sales side. And obviously it was a big issue for all those, little bookstore owners, or the big ones, Barnes and Noble for that matter, which had to close all the shops in the US, right? Amongst the problems they're in anyway. For us who look more into the Kindle side, we then said, hey, what's happening on the ebook side? And then that's a graph I already showed, and we do have also an update later towards the end. But you see what happened. The increase for ebooks basically doubled on Google search interest. Does that mean sales doubled? Obviously not. But when I had my first talk about the subject, you had people like, Dan from Drafted Digital and a couple of, distributors, and they all said after a brief slump, they saw a rise in ebook sales. And I'd be curious to what your clients viewed, because just 2 days ago, we started looking into the numbers that basically the big publishers started reporting. And this will be an interesting strategic discussion, because we reported on people who already are in the ebook industry that they reported brief slump, but then really strong increase in some genres, kids book, juvenile fiction, teen young adult, you name it. But what then happened was that here, and this is just, the text narrative straight from the press, the big publishers last week started reporting on their first quarter numbers. And there you have a very interesting, not only between the lines, but explicit statements where, for example, here, Simon Schuster, they reported that their first quarter, the ebook sales were up 13% versus Christmas and 25 to 50% over 2019. Imagine, that is a huge increase. Or that it was like HarperCollins, they reported it is up 21% in the comparable quarter in fiscal 2019. These are huge increases.
Yeah.
I mean, massive, for people who always dismissed ebooks completely.
Yeah, and the clients, we've, first off, when things started getting bad, we went and initially stress tested their business, just making sure that their business would be prepared for, what might come. Right.
Right.
And in that we would talk about where sales were, and generally speaking, all of our clients sales either stayed about the same or have gone up.
There you go.
There have been a few of them that launched books during this period, and not that these were horrible launches. A lot of people would give their right arm for the numbers that these people made on their launches, but they were different.
Right.
And I think it had to do a lot with in the early stage of the lockdown and the kind of the news spread of COVID-19, people's obsession with news and adjusting to their new kind of family situation if they were going into shelter in place.
Yeah.
And that just limited their ability to do any kind of recreational reading.
Yeah. And that's interesting. So the overall situation seems to resonate with what you're seeing in the front lines, so to speak. And building on that, I think, by now the number is a month old, and I think we're still waiting for the April number, or is it out already? I don't
think it's out yet.
But the KDP. The KDP number for March, right? The famous 29 million that was announced. That meant basically unprecedented growth, right? It's never been there before. The number, the 29 million, has been reported in many a Facebook group, right? Where if we look at the Kindle Select Global Fund over the last 5 years, obviously it has almost always gone up and up and up trend-wise. So people noted the 29 million, but what many did not note was that 29 million represented the highest ever increase in 4 years from a March to the February. And it was, so the biggest month-on-month increase. It was the biggest annual increase. I don't want to bore your viewers here with all the numbers, but also here, every little bar shows the percentage growth of that fund as monthly growth rates. So what you see at the very right-hand side, this green bar, the 6.6%, were the month-on-month growth from that fund versus February. So you see it's basically the highest green bar. The green bars are all the March numbers over the last 5 years. And what we also saw, there is always a seasonal dip for some reason in the February numbers of the fund. So there's always a dip in February, which are the red bars. But the one we saw in 2020 is, apart from that data outlier in 2018, is the lowest decline we ever saw in February. So, overall situation, well, not so bad as a market environment. So good news. And then, once we go into the details, it was really fun. We don't have to go through all the slides here, but I found it so interesting how the things really directly translated into Amazon book categories and what's happening there. The first not fun insight, but striking insight was that, like immediate survival interest sells, where all of a sudden you have these huge surges in categories about, medical ebooks, respiratory illnesses, anything that has even reference books on where to get medical supplies. There's a dedicated category for it. And you suddenly saw graphs that looks like this. That's fun here, So, like completely obscure categories. It's probably one of the worst selling categories there are out of 7,000. So if you're a nonfiction medical ebooks, reference, instrument, and supplies, when nobody could get the masks, all of a sudden people were buying ebooks with, hey, where can we get the masks from? Unsurprisingly, obviously, we got a pretty significant uptick in any book that had to do with, I'm a parent, that had to do with our situation. All of a sudden you are confronted with the homeschooling. So here the whole category on books about teacher resources homeschooling, shoots up in the air by 50%. And conversely, I mean, obviously every person in spring is preparing for the next honeymoon or trip to Italy, after Easter. Now look at this. This is what happened to the category.
Wow.
Travel books, Europe, Italy, Florence. So especially in the nonfiction area, you had things super and directly impacted by COVID-19. And we'll shift to fiction in just a second. But this is where the data was just, I mean, for me, by the way, it was very encouraging, because you look at these things and then you think, well, some of the data does seem to make sense. It was almost like a quality assurance thing. And then, people went into fighting the lockdown blues, and you saw things rise, just very quickly going through. We saw things rise in gardening and horticulture, vegetables, people in the lockdown who had a garden suddenly, well, there's always a spring upturn, but this time,
Sure.
this time it was higher. You had people who believe in God, and and who tried to find consolation in, hey, this big disaster, turn back to their religious faith, and you have an uptick in. This is a nonfiction example here. Christian books and Bibles, ministry, evangelism, sermons. So very specific. And you saw a very similar uptick, by the way, in a fiction genre that has not done so well over the last 2-3 years, which was Christian fantasy. That is going up. So, and some people, were then looking into motivation, business books, self-help, improvement. Also here, there was like a 3-year decline in the category, and it has come up. So that was a bit the overall situation that happened. That was very visible in the nonfiction books. Obviously, there were ambulance chasers who then jumped onto, I think we measured about 2,000 new titles being published with a keyword in the title or book description, COVID-19 or coronavirus. I think to some degree, Amazon also, put a brake on it, not pushing these books, but they're not selling. So these people failed. And then everybody asked me, oh, so what happened in fiction? And I think the good news was,
well, just one thing there, Alex.
Yeah.
In looking at the data, did you see any change in the number of new titles coming out during this period?
I frankly have not measured it, but we actually could have a look, because we do track, obviously, the increase in size, so number of titles in various categories. So I mean, while we still talk, I might open the database and we could have a look. Because it's an interesting question, because we know from Facebook groups, some people held back their launches, or some people tried and then didn't work as well, and now others held back. I think net hypothesis, and once I have the data, perhaps for the recording, or to put a link to a graph as this goes live. Interesting analysis. Net, perhaps nothing happened, because we know a lot of people tried to chase ambulances and published books in nonfiction. But the pace of additions in fiction, I could imagine that it has slowed down a bit. And I will definitely have a look at that data.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I think that's, kind of that rate of change, generally speaking, I think is going to be interesting to see, because just from my point of view, is, in a smaller viewpoint, what happened because of this particular incident. I know with the question I was asked a lot is like, should I launch or not? And my answer was always, well, you need to do what your fans expect.
Right.
You just don't have the same kind of expectations on results.
Yeah.
But then the other thing is, I'm interested in for us to continue to look at and talk over maybe in future episodes is, does this cause some kind of shakeout in the industry? Is there, do we lose a group of authors that we're producing that aren't going to produce in the future, and that rate of production of new books starts to slow?
Yeah. So actually, I do have a little bit of an answer for you. I just opened my, the timeline database that goes back, like years and years. And I just punched in here the overall romance genre as a filter. And we're still tracking the monthly increment of titles by, subcategories. And basically with that, we can always, have a pretty good grip on how many titles are added every month. And in some categories, we have it down to the book. Just on the helicopter numbers. So if I look at, usually the romance genre has additions around 2% in book supply per month. So if I look at November 2019, the growth in book supply in the romance overall category was 2%, December 2.19%, January it was still 2.11%, then in February it started dropping to 1.61%, started March below 2%, April below 2%, and now in May it's back up above 2%, right? So there was a bit of a slowdown with people.
Yeah.
Obviously we could look at all the genres, but hypothesis based on this data, people did get back on a break again. However, if I just look at the May number, it's 2.6%. So it's over proportionally high. And that is what is my personal hypothesis for a lot of stuff around the economy. I mean, if you've been a writer 2 months in the writing cave and you're super productive or not so productive, depending on your Netflix consumption,
yeah,
you are there ready to hit the road again as things open up again. And I think what we see here in the additions of title data already for May is, hey, people have been holding back, but the books still need to be published, and now they come.
Well, I remember that data that you prepared for me for NINC, for my presentation there. I was just floored by the production year over year. And I think you did it for, romance and lit RPG. And while lit RPG wasn't as surprising because it's this new genre that people were jumping on, the fact that romance is so big and it's still growing at that 2% per month, like this isn't like some tiny economy that's doing a bunch of growth percentage wise. It's a huge economy.
It's a huge production. So just in absolute numbers, the additions to the store between April 2020 and May were, what is this here, around 12, we're talking about close to, it's 18,000 romance titles that got added in 1 month to the store. So that is the amount of titles we're looking at.
Well, and think about this one because of and you've seen my graphs of some of the stuff I've put together on how books are consumed. Those 18,000 titles were consumed by the majority of their audience in 90 days.
Yeah.
Right.
Either obviously there will be lots of launches and that is still a phenomenon. There is no barriers. What do you call it in economics? Barriers of entry or barriers to entry, right? Into the economy. But what was interesting, people then asked me, well, hey, during COVID, what happened to prices?
Great question.
With the slowing, well, if the supply, let's have a look at that one. That's a really interesting one. Just going here we're not talking about the ambulance chasers. Let me just get the pricing chart here.
Yeah.
So the ambulance chaser, just to make the point how fast people are in reacting, indie authors. Look at this. This is the number of titles that we're talking 18,000 titles being added in 1 month in romance. Well, here is this thing happening, and you have within 2 months, 2,100 titles being added to the store that have something to do with coronavirus or COVID. By the way, 99% of those were complete non-sellers. So the ambulance chasing did not work. But this is not to talk about ambulance chasing, but just to to re-emphasize the agility and the speed with which the indie authors react to whatever it is, crisis, things, opportunities. It is very, very fast. As we talked earlier, we saw there is this increase in demand for ebooks by 20% and more, as reported even by the big publishers. So what happened on the pricing side was, if the supply is slowing down, not so much titles being added, but the demand all of a sudden shoots through the roof, what happens to prices? And here the answer is, we did not see any drastic shifts in prices, people dropping prices left, right, and center. In fact, what we're seeing is this picture. So this is romance average prices for the top 100, which we take as an indicator. Now, I know the body is books is so big, can the top 100 be representative? Perhaps not, but we still take them as an indicator, and it has proven in the past, that it's the best indicator we possibly have. And you can break this down to all the sub categories. But if you just look at the aggregate picture, the last 3 months, you saw, first of all, there is a longer term price increase in romance prices. And we know romance have been the worst prices time immemorial. So that is going up. And my hypothesis is here, two things happening at the same time. The one thing is, this is not that traditional publishers become suddenly with their expensive ebooks better than the indies or something. I merely think that indies have come to terms with, well, I have now advertising costs. It's pay to play. So shall I advertise, a 99-cent books or a $4.99 books? And I see many authors opt for the latter, that they say, hey, the cost of marketing, whether it is 99 cents book or a $4.99 book or a $5.99 book, it's the same cost of marketing. So to have a better return and to be able to cover the cost per click or a cost per conversion, I have to raise the price so that the ads pay, have a break even. Now, I know there's other tactics with, cheap number one title and series and read-throughs, but that is the picture. So long story short, April, May, we saw, if anything, we saw an increase in prices in romance. In mystery, thriller, suspense, there already the price level is higher than romance. Was a bit weakening over the course of 2019, second half of 2019, but you see what's happening during the Corona crisis. The curve goes back up, so prices increase. And the very same happening here in sci-fi and fantasy, where we have an overall, positive evolution, but also during the March, April, May, prices have gone up, if anything, which to me makes sense if either there is a slowdown in supply combined with an increase in demand by all the people sitting in home, potentially now even traditional publishers coming to terms with, ebooks are an opportunity or the only alternative if my print book retail shops are closed. So yeah, that's what's happened to the price side here.
Sure. And I would also say, I think that another part that may play into this is indie authors are coming to terms with the value of their work and their understanding that they can charge more.
Right. Yeah.
I know there's been some authors that have, done some very deliberate things with their pricing strategy and seeing, well, I didn't lose, what that price increase got me as far as in gross dollar increases. I didn't see any measurable loss in customers. So
right.
They've continued to hold that.
Yeah. So that was a big discussion we saw. Then we also saw the question around, well, what happened to, we now know print is under pressure, but what happened during the crisis also to audiobooks? So who gained if print lost? And also here, I felt it was a bit counterintuitive at first, because unsurprisingly, there is a big win for the ebook format. And just to show this one, what happened here in essence, we saw a massive gain
Mm.
for the ebook format. And you know that basically the bestseller lists are at the top level of Amazon are not print bestseller lists. They are, as soon as you go into a major category, they're cross format. So you can see, hey, why in books romance are all the top titles Kindle editions, right? So you can measure the penetration of formats in the various categories. And you may remember, Joe, that we showed in Vegas this picture. That was in the 2018 Vegas edition, where we looked at what percentage share of the top 100 in any given of these 30 listed genres is Kindle versus print versus audio. And that was the picture back then. And I remember when we then showed the numbers 2 years later, 2019, we saw that shift.
Yeah, this is amazing.
That was pre-COVID, right? So that is year-end 2019. Now look at what happens between end of 2019 and mid-April this year, 2020. Boom. Yeah. So we see basically two things. We saw another gain by the red area, which is Kindle editions. We saw, if I scroll back, it's almost a neutral development, even a slight loss for audiobooks.
Yeah.
And I found that a bit counterintuitive at first. But then I thought, hey, Audible books are expensive unless you have a subscription. People may not spend as much. And the other thing is, if we look at the rankings of what categories sell well in ebooks, we see a lot of nonfiction, the type of self-help stuff you listen to when you're in the traffic jam driving to work.
That doesn't surprise me.
So
I would just assume that if you cut out all that commuting time and time of people at the gym on treadmills, that's where they're listening to those books.
Yeah, very good point. So that got hampered, and therefore the big winners, just in terms of percentage gain, and that is like the format shift. Romance was not so much affected because already 90% of the books in the top 100 are Kindle editions, right? So not much to gain in the top end, but all the books about health, fitness, travel, business and money, computers, cookbooks, all the stuff that is traditionally print book focused got a very significant rise during this time. And we just released actually our one new report, maybe not that relevant for your direct audience, but I found it remarkable that what we saw earlier, this twofold increase in ebook interest on Google. In the same period, the interest for ebooks for kids rose by 10 times, right? And when you at the time went to the Kindle store, you suddenly saw the top 100 Amazon store-wide books plastered with kids' book titles. You see here probably what we read when we were a kid, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, right?
Yep. There's
bottom left. That's the book our parents read to us when we were kids, Joe. And it's a number 14 bestseller bookstore wide. And if you then check the Kindle edition, you saw many Kindle editions do so well because if the books get not shipped, which we know happened also for a certain period of time, the parents basically, we saw during this time, device sales rise in the electronics department where, the Kindle Fires devices shot up also for the homeschooling requirements. And then this was just, 2 weeks ago where The Bad Seed, a kid's book, is on the Kindle bestseller list #1 store wide. And there were a couple of kids book titles ranking very high. So what happened
the other thing similar to this is if you look at what videos are ranking on YouTube, it's all kids videos are the top ranking videos. It's not the ones you used to see with, guys doing pranks and stuff like that. It's all kids videos and it's millions and millions of views.
Exactly. Which brings me to, one, I don't know whether it's the last observation, but another big observation was in some instances, the crisis was merely amplifying a trend that was already there. So for example, in the kids of ebooks, this is the 18 months graph, and it becomes a bit more visible if you take a longer term view onto the kids book genre. This is like 5 years, what we see here. And you see, of course, it is a very seasonal genre where all the peaks were always like Christmas time, right? So December, January. And the second peak is always Easter time. And we see that in all the years before, it was like a very short 1 month peak, and then the books dropped back down. But already Christmas 2000, year end 2018, 2019, we saw a peak, but the drop back down, was not as big anymore. And here we are in Christmas or 2020, so Christmas 2019, year change 2020, where we see it's an all-time high for the kids book genre per se. And then, Easter comes as the second peak, and this is where we had all the kids book all of a sudden here in the top 100. But you see, if you look at it longer term, the crisis only amplified a positive thing that was already there.
Yeah. Well, that's for those folks that have been trying to, that are children's book writers, this is really a great trend for them, because I know it's been something that they've struggled with, that whole thing of parents wanting their kids to read physical books. And, those, I know in our case, we when we were raising our kids, we had that. And at some point we were like, we're fine with them just being on screens, just as long as they're out of our hair.
I always have to tear the iPad out of the hand of my daughter, and you try to whatever, put Kaspersky on it and restrict viewing time and all that stuff that in practice doesn't really work. Because you have but I had the discussion earlier with someone where we asked ourselves, well, great, how much of that change will stick, right? And it's a good question. I don't have the answer, but I would say once you've given kids the electronic device, and once they get used to spending a certain time on it, it's very hard to turn back the wheel. So parents have now perhaps 2 Kindle Fire devices at home, Prime subscription, Kindle subscription, Netflix subscription, you name it. These things are being used, right? So maybe we see a bit of a shift. With the teens, I'm not so sure. Also here, by the way, we saw quite a bit of a shift. So basically the trend was that we observed teenagers read again, or they were forced to read again because there was nothing else to do during the lockdown. And I know some of the fact may be attributed to, I think, Suzanne Collins. She released like a new book, so that may have helped in general, right? But what we did also observe here, let me just put this one up, is this one here in teen young adult. If you look at teen young adult overall, it was not that big a change in the graph. This is the average sales rank of the overall teen young adult list. But you see, well, in relative terms, it's always been here in the top 800, but, from April to May, quite a significant rise. And once you get then into sub categories, what we did observe was what I found an interesting thing where, for example, in things like teen young adult, romance, sci-fi, dystopian. So if you look into what are the books in that category, you typically have the Hunger Games, Divergent type of books, and the Kira Kass. I hope I pronounce her name right. She's always like very up there in that category, right? Now, the rise you see may not be, is drastic, but the picture becomes even more drastic if you look at it from a 4-year perspective, right? Where, 2015, I think that's the high times of the whole Hunger Games type of hype.
Mm-hmm.
and many people benefited from that. Then you see actually like a 4-year continuous decline if you cut through the peaks and valleys of the monthly sales rank fluctuations, where you might argue, well, was it new good books in the genre, or was it the crisis with teens having to read again that come as a savior to a genre, if you will, if you want, right? So
Mm-hmm.
interesting discussion to be had with teens. It will be interesting to see how that pans out, and whether they, keep on the reading habit. They now adopt it. Yeah. So I don't know. What's your thought? Where does this leave? Where does that leave us? With the time going forward.
Yeah, I think that the important thing about what you do and what we can take from this is that you have to revisit it, right? Like you showed in your charts, it isn't just seeing what's going on right now, it's in comparison to the past. So that we can see, are we in uptrends or downtrends? And, and putting that into context with what's happened, in the overall market. I mean, you think about it, it's kind of crazy that even without this particular event, the Kindle store was growing, right? It was growing at a pretty decent clip. And now all of a sudden we see within that, there's even more growth. So, what I would love to do is, revisit this in, like 6 weeks with you and see what we really can track on things like, are we still seeing the same kind of growth? Did it hold? Like you asked, like that question, is it holding? Some of these other things, are we going to see a washout of authors? I know from my experience with any downturn, there's people that go out of that industry, but then there's also new entrants. So what will happen? And is there going to be a growth or loss of authors producing work?
Yeah. And I think that potential exit of some authors, to be honest, in my mind, will have not so much to do with the actual book market, because we know that many of the authors that are active on the platform they are not full-time writers. Obviously the big hitters and some people you work with, they are, but many others are the aspiring writer, or they are the writer who have this as a side job, who still work at whatever, in an accounting firm or at McDonald's or at a hairdresser, whatever it is. But many of these people lost their job. So whilst you could argue, okay, they have more time to write, I mean, that would be ridiculous. These people are in survival mode, right? They lost their job and they now may go to McDonald's or whatever they can do to make ends meet. And they will not opt for, I will now take 6 months to finish my sci-fi trilogy and then have this, launch, and then I feed my family. That is that is not what they can afford. So yes, I do believe we see some authors exiting, but I don't think it is because of any underlying health issue of the Kindle market. It is just because of circumstance, of their personal circumstance and the overall economy.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I would believe that those who did not lose their jobs, or those who could stay at home and suddenly use the time very productively because, whatever, they were on a financial cushion and they had nothing to worry about. I can, by the same token, imagine there are lots of authors who finally had the time and focus to actually finish their book. So what is the net effect? Very hard to tell. But as we go forward, we did have a look at the overall market numbers, and I think that is one we should definitely revisit in 6 months or 6 weeks times. Even
6 weeks time,
6 weeks time, because the picture is very, very short term, because in that meantime, two things will happen. We will have the April numbers for the Kindle Select Global Fund, perhaps even the May numbers by that time already. And we know we started off with this picture, this rapid increase in search interest for ebooks. Now, at the same time, this was the search interest for coronavirus. Now, it's not drawn to the same scale. Very important disclaimer. So the absolute interest for the red one was probably 68 times as big as the blue line. But just to plot it from a pattern wise, so if we overlay it in here, Ricardo from Rizzi said, hey, you really have to put a disclaimer on it. And I did put one on it. I just, it's not on this version. But here, as I said, the big question is, well, you can already see, the rise in ebook interest was almost immediate with all that lockdown stuff. Yeah. But while the interest for coronavirus is already, significantly going back down again, as people, unless you're on a ventilator yourself and having health issues or losing people in your family, you try to go back to normal, right? And that data just reflects that. So the big question, which we should revisit in 6 weeks from now, is, well, what pattern did we see for the blue curve? Was it like super sticky? Is it like typical inertia in the market, or was it just a fleeting hype and we're going back to normal? I don't know yet. We don't know yet. Whatever the case may be, if we just took the Q1 numbers of the KDP Global Fund and used what the Q1 usually represents in a year, and I know it's super crude, right? But it does take into account seasonality. So if we only did that and did not do anything else, and we factored in the decline in February, which we always have every year, we would still be talking about a slightly growing market. So I think as this fills up here, first quarter, and we add the April numbers, I think by June, we will have a pretty good picture of what the year will hold for the industry, and especially obviously for many of our clients who are heavily active on KU and Kindle per se.
Yeah. No, that's really awesome, the stuff you put together. And it's the stuff that I love seeing because it's helpful for me to understand the context of the whole marketplace. For the clients that I'm working with, they're all kind of unique, either because of the genre they're in or where they are in their career. And you're always trying to understand is what's going on in their particular business plan in sync with the market. And, the last thing you'd want to be is like, hey, all these guys are doing great, but the overall market is tanking, right? Like, so to see that the market is actually doing well and that there's demand should be really heartening.
I found it very encouraging too, and because there has been and still is so much bad news out there. If you look at one of the few graphs that point up instead of down, that's just a good thing to even just see, because everybody's only about, this took a dive in the automotive industry and this industry and that industry. I think, yes, some people did lose their jobs, and I have clients who said, sorry, I have to cancel my k-lytics subscription. I just lost my job. I have to cut expenses, gym, any discretionary spend left, right, and center. At the same time, you had people who sign up and say, hey, that was the first time I really can focus on my writing and do something. So I wish all the best of luck, to those, excuse me, to those who did launch or who are in trouble. We'll see.
Well, Alex, it's been great to have you on there. I really appreciate the data you've put together, and we'll, like I said, let's set a date for 6 weeks from now to revisit this stuff. In the meantime, where can people find you and learn more about the subscription service that you provide for your deep dive data?
Well, as you know, we offer genre reports and that database I mentioned. Simply go to k-lytics.com. It's k-lytics.com. Joe may do put a link in the
I'll put a
bottom of
link
this
in.
video. And also, by all means, if you have questions, just contact me. Contact me anytime. You can reach me at support@k-lytics.com, and otherwise, just have a look at what we offer. Maybe the database is interesting to you, or the individual genre reports. If you just focus on one genre, we'd of course welcome you. And as said, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, and I would say to anybody that's watching this that's looking to really understand a specific genre, if there is a report that Alex has put together, you're going to find it's very comprehensive. It's not just data, it's also diving into things like what book covers look like and keywords and tropes. There's great stuff that you've pulled together there from teasing that out of the stuff you scrape off of Amazon.
Thank you very much.
All right. It's good to have you on, man. Thanks a lot.
Hey, thanks a lot. Good to see you again. And hey, let's reconvene and then we'll see where this all came out. Huh?
All right. And